My name is Sharon, and when I think back to that period, it feels like I'm watching my life from afar, like a movie where the main character is too young, too naive, and too confident in her control. I was 27 then, working as a senior manager at my parents' company in Denver, and frankly, I was more proud of it than I should have been. My mom, Monica, and dad, Robert, built that business from scratch, pouring sleepless nights, family holidays, vacations, and nerves into it. I grew up between reports, deliveries, and meetings, and when I graduated from college, it didn't even occur to me to look for a place to work. Everything seemed correct, orderly, like a schedule in a notebook, with no room for chance. And then Brandon Harris showed up. At first glance, he was polite, attentive, even too correct. He opened doors for me, brought me coffee with just the right amount of sugar I'd once casually mentioned, asked how my day had been, and listened as if every word mattered. I thought I'd fallen in love, genuinely, deeply, with gratitude that someone finally saw me as more than Robert's daughter, but simply a woman. His family lived in a small town in West Virginia, and their life was, to put it mildly, modest. His father worked in a factory, his mother didn't work at all, and when I first went to meet them, I tried not to think about the gulf between our worlds that no staircase could bridge. They seemed abrupt, loud, and rude to me. They interrupted each other, laughed at things I found inappropriate, and acted as if I'd been honored to be allowed to date their son, but I shrugged it off. Love evens out everything, right? That's what I thought. My parents were wary from the start. Dad asked if I was sure I knew Brandon enough to build a life with him. Mom tried to gently explain that I shouldn't rush things, that a year isn't long enough to truly understand someone. I stubbornly defended myself, saying they weren't giving me a chance to grow up, that I didn't have to live under their wing my whole life. In the end, they relented, not because they believed me, but because they loved me. We set a wedding date for 4 months later. My parents decided they wanted to give me a head start. As Mom said, a home is an anchor. Once you have your own, everything will be easier. And so they bought one, a small, cozy house in the Denver suburbs, with a green lawn where I'd already seen morning breakfasts with Brandon, 3 bedrooms, 2 bathrooms, a white kitchen that smelled of fresh paint and new dreams. Dad personally oversaw the renovation, coming there almost every day, arguing with the contractors, picking out tiles and curtains, as if he were building not a house but happiness. When everything was ready, on the day the renovation was completed, the 3 of us drove over to see the finished product. I couldn't sit still in the car, my heart was pounding in my throat. This was supposed to be my home, my new life, everything, a clean slate. But when we pulled up, I saw Brandon's car in the driveway, and 2 others, his dad's old pickup truck and his mother's battered sedan. My parents and I exchanged glances. I remember my mom squinting, as if trying to see clearly. We got out of the car and, as we approached, heard voices, shouts, a woman's voice, sharp and irritated. Those neighbors are too close. We need to put up a fence. I don't like people looking at us. It was Mrs. Harris, my future mother-in-law. Mom, Dad, and I exchanged a quick glance, the kind where words fail, yet everything is clear. We entered the house, and what we found there was a scene I don't think I'll ever forget. Brandon, his mother, and father wandered through the rooms as if they owned the place. Not a single one of them said hello or thank you, or even glanced in our direction. Mrs. Harris sat upright on the new bed, her dirty shoes on, her bags laid out beside her, as if she'd already decided this was her place. The white blanket I'd chosen myself was stained with gray marks. Mr. Harris stood by the window, smoking, and then, right before our eyes, stubbed out his cigarette on the bedside table, leaving a dark stain on the wood. "What are you doing?" I blurted out. My voice wavered, higher than I'd intended. Mrs. Harris raised her head lazily, as if I'd distracted her. "Relax, Sharon," she said, "we were just looking at the house." "Without asking me?" I replied. Mr. Harris turned, inhaled smoke, and, without even looking at me, said, "This will be our son's house, we have a right to see it." My father, standing nearby, clenched his fists but said calmly, tensely, "This house is a gift to my daughter." Mrs. Harris waved her hand, leaning back against the pillows. "Well, she's marrying Brandon, so that means this is his house too." Then she stretched out on the bed again and added with a grin, "We'll take this bedroom, the biggest one." I stepped forward and said firmly, coldly, clearly, that won't happen. Mr. Harris passed me in the hallway, his footsteps heavy, as if he were walking through his own home, and it made my stomach churn. He opened the door to the guest room without asking, peered inside, and, shaking his head, said with that smug air that sent a chill down my spine, "This would be perfect for Mason." "Who's Mason?" Mom asked, surprised, taking a step closer. "Our grandson," he replied, as if stating the obvious, "is Brandon's nephew." He turned to Brandon and added, his tone now commanding, "Call your brother, right now, tell Jacob to break the lease and move here, with Ashley and the baby." Brandon obediently pulled out his phone, and in that moment, I felt my insides freeze. "Wait," I said, trying not to lose my temper, "what are you even saying?" Mr. Harris turned to me, his irritation evident, as if I'd interrupted an important meeting. "Jacob and his wife need a stable place," he said. "Mason will be starting school soon, this house would be perfect for them." "This is my home," I said quietly, but with the firmness that comes from desperation. He acted as if he hadn't heard, continuing to speak, looking right through me. "For Mason's future, you and Brandon can come back here later, when you have kids. In the meantime, you can rent an apartment somewhere closer to work." I stood there, stunned, feeling the ground shifting beneath my feet, because this house was my parents' gift, their love, their labor, their hope, and someone had just decided to turn it into a dorm for other people's relatives. "This isn't a boarding house for your whole family." My voice broke, but I couldn't stop myself. Mr. Harris's face flushed, the vein in his temple bulged, and he stepped closer to me. "The house belongs to my son, which means it belongs to us. You should learn to respect your future father-in-law." Mrs. Harris sat back down on the bed and slapped her palm on the blanket, as if emphasizing her place. "And as our future daughter-in-law, you must take care of our needs. Sharon, you should hire a maid to keep everything in order once we move in." Mama stepped forward, her eyes darkening, and her voice hoarse but confident. "If you want a home and someone to care for you, you must pay for it yourself." Mrs. Harris's mouth dropped open as if she'd been slapped. "How dare you talk to us like beggars? We're family." "Don't talk to my mother like that," I blurted out, and at that moment Brandon grabbed my wrist, his fingers dug into my skin, his grip firm, unexpected. "Sharon," he said quietly, but in a tone that terrified me, "you just apologized to my parents." "Let go." I tried to pull away, but he squeezed my hand even harder, as if testing it. Mr. Harris pointed at my parents, and his voice was so venomous that the air in the room grew thick. "This is what happens when you raise a daughter wrong. Don't worry, Brandon will teach her how to behave after marriage." He turned to his son, nodded, and said, looking him straight in the eyes, "Sometimes a woman needs to be hit, that's the only way she'll learn to obey." Brandon nodded. I saw it, a brief, almost imperceptible movement of the head, and I felt a chill, as if someone had opened a window in the middle of winter. I jerked my hand away and finally managed to break free. "You didn't bring a single cent to our wedding," I screamed, my voice breaking, but I couldn't keep quiet. "You don't have a house, a car, or a penny. And now you act like it's all yours." Mr. Harris laughed, a low, unpleasant laugh, with the humiliating contempt with which grown men sometimes crush those they consider weaker. "You threw yourself at Brandon. You're not young anymore, Sharon. If you were worth anything, your parents wouldn't have had to bribe a man to marry you by buying him a house and showering him with gifts." My hand shook, but I raised my head and looked at my parents. "I won't marry him," I said. My father looked at me silently, but there was something like pride in his gaze, as if he were only now seeing in me the woman he had raised. I turned to Brandon. "We come from different worlds, this will never work. Take your parents and get out of my house." Mrs. Harris jumped out of bed, her face twisted. "If you call off the wedding, my son will never take you back." "Okay," I replied, simple, no screaming, no hysteria. Mr. Harris came up close to me, his voice hissing. "You're pathetic, you're an ugly girl that no man wants, you'll be alone." He didn't have time to say more. My father's fist, heavy and sharp, slammed into his face with a dull thud, as if the house had decided to defend itself. The blow was precise, without wasted movement, and in the silence that followed, even the clock stopped ticking. Mr. Harris flew back, hit the floor, and Mrs. Harris screamed as if the house had become the scene of her own personal tragedy. "He's beating my husband." My father stood calmly, without moving, and said in a low, even voice, "Say another word, and you will not leave this house on your own 2 feet." My father stood motionless, and I saw the muscles in his jaw tense. The silence that followed his words was thick and heavy, like a thunderstorm about to strike. Then he suddenly stepped forward, sharply, without warning, and his hand whistled through the air. The blow hit Brandon in the face so hard that he staggered and hit his shoulder against the wall. "This is for allowing them to insult my daughter," my father said in a low voice that sent shivers down my spine. Brandon silently wiped the blood from his lip, but said nothing, no apology, no anger, nothing, just this strange resignation, as if everything happening to him was an inevitable punishment. Then my father walked up to Mr. Harris, grabbed him by the collar, lifted him from the floor as if he weighed no more than an empty sack, and said with a terrifying confidence I'd never heard in his voice before, "Even if Sharon wanted to marry and join your family, I wouldn't allow it. My daughter is smart, beautiful, and capable. She's too good for your son." Then he roughly pushed Mr. Harris toward the door, and he stumbled, barely keeping his feet, and ran out of the house, leaving behind the smell of tobacco and humiliation. Mrs. Harris screamed, rushed toward Brandon, grabbed his hand, and dragged him toward the exit, not forgetting to turn around and shout, "You'll regret this." Her voice trembled, like a woman accustomed to making final decisions, but it already held a hint of anger mixed with fear. When the door slammed behind them, the house fell silent, the air was thick, almost viscous, and I felt tears streaming down my cheeks, not from fear or resentment, but from relief that came unexpectedly, like a deep breath after a long, held one. "You were right," I whispered, sinking into a chair, "you were both right about him." Mom came over and hugged me, tightly, like a mother, the way you hug when words are no longer necessary. "It's okay, honey," she said softly, "it ended the way it was supposed to." Several weeks passed after that day. I returned to work, immersing myself in it, grasping every task, every meeting like a lifeline, anything to keep me from thinking about Brandon and his terrible family. I tried to convince myself that it was all over, that I was back on my feet, and that now I could just live. But one morning, when I opened my email, I saw a letter from him. My fingers trembled as I clicked on the attachment. Inside was a table, neatly arranged by day and month, with numbers and comments. Coffee at Starbucks, March 15th, $14.50. Flowers for Valentine's Day, $35. Uber ride, April 3rd, $18. Dinner at an Italian restaurant, May 20th, $67. And so on, line after line, ad infinitum. At the bottom, in bold, was the amount, $3,247.82. And beneath it, a short message, "You owe me this money, pay by next Friday, or I'll come to your office." I reread the email several times, disbelieving my eyes. It was so absurd I couldn't even laugh. He wanted me to pay him for the coffee and the Uber rides, for every dinner, for every rose, for every evening spent together, and all this, after I'd been the one paying for almost everything throughout our relationship. I remembered making restaurant reservations, paying for movies with my card, buying him gifts because I thought that's how it should be when you love. I remembered buying him a new iPhone for $1,400 because the old one suddenly stopped working, and he gave me a Target gift card for $150 in return. When his father's health problems started, I didn't hesitate to transfer money for his treatment. $1,800 I paid because I loved him, and now he was charging me for coffee, for 82 cents. I closed the email and decided I wouldn't reply, I wouldn't give a cent, I wouldn't humiliate myself. A week passed. I was sitting in the office when my assistant, Emily, a young, nervous woman who always worried too much about everything, knocked on the door. "Sharon," she said, turning pale, "there are some people here who want to see you. They have a poster." "What poster?" I frowned, but before I could finish, the door swung open. Brandon, his mother, and father walked into my office. Mr. Harris carried a huge white poster with bright red letters. It read, "Sharon owes Brandon $3,247.82, and beneath it was the very same list from the letter: coffee, flowers, dinner, Uber. Mrs. Harris followed, her face flushed, her voice loud and shrill. That woman dated my son for a year. She spent all his money, and now she's not paying him back. People from the neighboring offices began to emerge, peering around the doors. Someone from the accounting department stopped with a cup of coffee, someone pretended to pass by, but froze at the threshold. Within seconds, a crowd had gathered around us. Mr. Harris held the sign up high and, like a performer on stage, began reading aloud. Coffee, $14.50, flowers, $35, Uber ride, $18. One person in the audience burst out laughing, then another, and the laughter rolled through the hallway like a wave. He's charging her for the coffee, someone said. And for 82 cents, another added. The laughter grew louder, and people couldn't contain themselves. Mrs. Harris's face turned crimson, and she stamped her foot. Stop laughing. This is serious. She owes my son money. But the laughter didn't subside, and I stood there in the middle of it all, feeling rage and shame mingle within me, turning into the icy calm before the storm. I stood in the middle of the office, surrounded by this absurd scene, the poster, the crowd, the laughter, and suddenly felt everything inside me become crystal clear, not anger, not humiliation, but a calm, icy calm, the kind that only comes to a woman after she's been pushed to the brink. I slowly approached my desk, feeling the coworkers' gazes sweep over me, as if each of them were expecting me to break down, burst into tears, or run away, but I wasn't about to give them that spectacle. I opened the drawer, took out my checkbook, sat down, and began writing, steadily, with a steady hand, until the ink fell smoothly and calmly onto the paper. I wrote a check for $3,500, just enough to cover their absurd bill and more, with room for the humiliation they'd tried to inflict on me. Then I stood up, walked over to Brandon, and threw the check at his chest. He caught it automatically, blinking in confusion, as if he didn't understand what had just happened. Here's your money, I said, feeling my voice tremble, not from fear, but from the strength that had finally broken through. Now pay me back what you owe me. He frowned, his lips parting. What? The iPhone I bought you. You know perfectly well how much it cost, $1,400, and your father's medical bills, $1,800, all of it was paid for with my checks, documented, give it back. He opened his mouth, then closed it, at a loss for words. Silence fell between us, and in that silence I suddenly realized how empty he was, fatherless, motherless, moneyless, prideless, a mere shell of a man who had spent his entire life relying on women to pay for him. Mrs. Harris, her face contorted with rage, lunged at me. You're petty, ungrateful, she began, but didn't have time to finish. My mother suddenly emerged from behind the employees. I hadn't even noticed her appearance. Her presence was like a sudden gust of wind, capable of ripping the falseness from everyone's faces at once. She stood between me and Mrs. Harris, calmly, but with such dignity that even those who had been laughing a second ago fell silent. Security, my mother shouted, get those three out of the office immediately. 2 security guards, tall men in dark suits, approached almost immediately, as if waiting for the command. One grabbed Mr. Harris by the shoulder, the other Brandon. They didn't resist, too confused, too humiliated to protest. Mrs. Harris continued to scream, struggling, her words drowned out by the noise of the crowd. You'll all pay for this, she screamed as she was dragged toward the elevator. But in response, there was applause, loud, hearty, genuine. The employees clapped, some even whistled, and for the first time in a long time, I allowed myself to smile, not from joy, but from the feeling that it was finally over. Only it turned out I was wrong. After leaving the office, Brandon didn't disappear, he simply changed tactics. A few days later, strange accounts began appearing online, new ones, without photos, but with recognizable content. He created fake accounts, posted made-up stories about me, and attributed terrible things to me. He took my photos from social media, from conferences, from trips where I was smiling, and edited them, turning each one into a mockery, an instrument of humiliation. He wrote under them, "This is the one who broke my heart, this is the woman who used me for money." The letters arrived every day, long, rambling, with desperate confessions, threats, and complaints. He wrote that he didn't know what he would do to himself if I didn't come back, that I had ruined his life, that I owed it to him to at least talk. At first, I didn't respond, then I blocked the emails, then I stopped reading them altogether, but the letters kept coming, like drops eating away at a stone. My parents finally couldn't take it anymore. They found a lawyer, a calm, competent man with cold eyes and a soft voice. He filed a harassment complaint and got a temporary restraining order. Brandon was now forbidden to come within 100 feet of me or to contact me in any way. After that, everything went silent. It was as if someone had turned off the background noise, leaving only the silence I once considered boring, but now considered salvation. I returned to work, fully. I worked evenings, took on new projects, went to meetings, spoke at conferences. Work became a refuge for me, the only place where everything was under control, where the numbers always made sense, and people behaved rationally. A few months later, I was invited to speak at a regional business conference. I represented our family company and gave a presentation on market trends and the prospects for small businesses. When I finished, several executives, investors, and analysts approached me. Everyone congratulated me, shook my hand, and said my speech was inspiring. Instead of adrenaline, I felt a quiet, grown-up pride coursing through my veins, not for success, but for persevering. During an online lunch after the conference, I met Daniel Mitchell. He was the co-founder of a major tech company, a Stanford graduate, and came from a family of entrepreneurs in Seattle. But none of that mattered. The important thing was that he was completely different, not like Brandon. He spoke slowly, considering every word. He listened without interrupting. He didn't try to flash wit or assert himself. His manner was respectful, calm, and possessed a certain inner confidence that didn't require grand gestures. After the conference, I received a letter from him, a real one, on paper, with real ink and his handwriting. He thanked me for the presentation and enclosed a book on leadership, writing that he thought I would enjoy it. This touched me more deeply than I wanted to admit. We began corresponding by email, discussing business, sharing ideas, links, books. Everything was simple, easy, without pretense. We met for coffee a few times to talk about the market, company development, and trends. We attended small business forums, sat next to each other in lecture halls, and laughed at identical comments from speakers. These weren't dates, this was something else, quiet, genuine, something that begins not with fireworks but with trust that builds slowly, step by step. When he offered me a ride home after that business evening, I wasn't expecting anything special. We'd spent the entire day among people in expensive suits and cold smiles, and now we were sitting in his car on a quiet street, with only the streetlight casting a soft glow on the dashboard. Daniel held the steering wheel with both hands, as if he were about to say something important, and the silence in the car was the kind that usually begets confessions. "Sharon," he said, turning to me, his voice a little lower than usual, almost hoarse, "I need to tell you something." I looked at him, and for the first time in a long time, I didn't want to analyze anything, didn't want to guess at the subtext, just listen. "I like you not because you're smart, successful, or independent," he continued, "although I respect all of those things about you. I like you because when I'm with you, life feels worth truly living, not surviving, not striving, not trying to fit in, just living. Does that make sense?" There was no game or fear in his eyes, only honesty, the kind that always disarms you when you're not ready for it. "Yes," I said quietly, feeling something warm and fragile well up inside me, something I hadn't felt in a long time. "It makes sense, and I'd like to try to build something with you." He smiled, slowly, genuinely, and his face immediately changed, soft, open, alive. That evening, for the first time, I understood how warm a man's smile can be when there's no hidden calculation behind it. After that night, we started dating, no pathos, no ostentatious gestures, just two people who are happy together. A few weeks later, he invited me to meet his parents. We flew to Seattle early in the morning. His parents' house stood on a hill overlooking the water, surrounded by old fir trees, and the air smelled of the sea. When the door opened, a woman greeted us with such a warm smile that I immediately felt welcome. "You must be Sharon," she said, hugging Daniel and turning to me. "We've heard so much about you. Please come in." His father sat in the living room, tall, gray-haired, with clear eyes. He rose, shook my hand, and said simply but sincerely, "Nice to meet you, Sharon, we're glad you came." We dined together, and the conversation flowed easily. They asked about my work, my family, my parents' business, and every question was filled with genuine curiosity, not veiled judgment. They listened when I spoke and didn't interrupt. It was a new feeling for me, to be heard without having to prove my worth. After dinner, we drank coffee, laughed, discussed the cities we grew up in, and I caught myself thinking that for the first time in a long time, I was among adults, well-mannered people, for whom respect wasn't a convention, but a natural part of communication. Later, Daniel suggested organizing a family reunion so our parents could get to know each other. It was an idea that would have previously terrified me, but now it seemed right. We chose an evening, and everything went surprisingly smoothly. My father and Daniel's father quickly found common ground. They discussed business and politics, told stories about their children, and laughed at how similar some parenting principles were in different families. "Your daughter is wonderful," Daniel's father said to my father, his words ringing not with politeness but with fact. "She's smart, level-headed, and knows exactly what she wants. We're so glad Daniel met her." My father nodded, smiling slightly, and for the first time in a long time, I noticed his gaze was free of worry. "Daniel is a good man, we can see that," he replied, his voice calm, almost grateful. It was an evening I'll never forget, warm, quiet, without strain, as if the universe had finally decided to show me how things can be when you don't have to defend yourself. A few weeks passed, a photo from a business event surfaced online, Daniel and I standing next to each other, talking to investors, nothing personal, just a moment captured on camera, but there was something obvious in the picture, two people comfortable together. How that photo got to Brandon, I didn't know, but one afternoon, as I was leaving the office, he was standing by the exit, as if waiting. "Well, Sharon, you've come a long way," he said, blocking my way. His voice was cold, with that old resentment that always rings out from those who blame the world but themselves. "Already in the arms of another man, huh?" "Brandon," I said, trying to keep my voice even, "there's a restraining order, you're not allowed here." "You were with him when you were still with me?" he almost shouted. "Is that why you left me?" "I left you," I replied, stepping forward, "because you and your family are terrible people. Now get out of my way." "You think you're better than me?" He stepped closer, and I caught the scent of cheap cologne, the same one that had once seemed sweet. His eyes gleamed with anger. And suddenly Daniel appeared next to me. I didn't even see him approach, I just felt the air around me change. "Get away from her," he said quietly, but in a way that left Brandon no chance to pretend he didn't understand. Daniel's voice was firm, confident, and it rang with that calm that is always stronger than any aggression. Brandon looked at Daniel, then back at me, his gaze heavy, tired, mingled with anger and self-pity. He smiled slightly, but there was no strength in it, only emptiness. "Is this your new boyfriend?" he asked, as if he wanted confirmation from me that the world had indeed gone wrong. Daniel stood calmly, without fuss, with that confident calm that requires no proof. "If you take one more step toward her," he said quietly, "I'll punch you in the face." There was no threat in those words, just a fact, and Brandon seemed to understand it. He looked at Daniel for a long moment, then at me, and at some point his expression changed, as if he realized for the first time that the game was over, that he could no longer control me, that I was no longer his weak spot, but his past. He turned away silently and walked away. I stood and watched him go, feeling some old, almost physical fear leave my chest with each step he took. That was the last time he bothered me. Several weeks passed, one of those warm spring days when the air smells of water and new grass. My mother and I decided to walk along the path by Lake Dillon. This place has always been special to us. As a child, I'd collect stones by the water, and my mother would patiently wait for me to choose the shiniest one. Back then, it seemed to me that all the good things in life could be found if you just looked closely. We walked slowly, enjoying the rare peace. The wind rustled the branches, sunbeams glittered on the water, and for a while we were simply silent. Then I said, "You know, Mom, I used to think I needed someone to love me for life to have meaning." Mom looked at me without interrupting, letting me finish. "And now?" she asked softly. "Now I understand that the most important thing is to learn to love yourself," I replied, "and that's enough." She smiled, squeezed my hand, and said quietly, "I always knew you would understand, it just took time." 6 months later, Daniel and I got engaged. It was simple, no publicity, no fanfare, just the two of us on the veranda of his house in Seattle, with cups of coffee and the sunrise breaking over the water. We set a wedding date for the following spring, and everything seemed so natural, as if life had finally fallen into place. But just before the wedding, Mrs. Harris resurfaced. She posted a long message on social media, written in the tone of a woman who believes she has the moral high ground. In it, she painted me as a monster, a cold, calculating, callous woman who, she said, had exploited her poor son and then abandoned him for no reason, heartbreaking him. She portrayed her family as victims, and herself as the sufferer who had been left with a terrible daughter-in-law. And, as often happens, some people believed her. I saw the post being shared, and comments like, "What a horrible woman, this is why no one wants relationships these days." It hurt me, though I tried not to show it. I kept silent for several months, deciding I didn't want to dredge up the past anymore, but then I realized that if I kept silent, the lies would remain the truth. I sat down at my laptop and wrote my own post. I told him everything, about how I once mistook Brandon's stinginess for practicality, how I mistook his silence for depth, about how I allowed his family to humiliate me, hoping that after marriage everything would change, how I bought my own engagement ring because he said he couldn't afford it. I wrote about how they tried to take away the house my parents gave me, how they were already planning to move the whole family there, his brother, his wife, his children, without even asking my consent. I told him how Mr. Harris once said over dinner that a woman needs to be beaten to learn her place, and how Brandon laughed and didn't object. I wrote about how they barged into my office with a sign, demanding money for coffee and Uber rides, how Brandon stalked me for weeks, how I had to go to court to get a restraining order, and I finished simply. To Brandon's family, I will never be your daughter-in-law. I was not a person to you, but a resource, a home, a wallet, a woman through whom you could get what you wanted, but I am no longer your prey, and I will never remain silent again. I clicked publish and closed my laptop. Within a few hours, the story began to spread across the internet. It was reposted, quoted, commented on. Women wrote that they recognized themselves. Men argued about who was right. Brandon's friends, his colleagues, even those who once told me I was too sensitive, saw the story. A week later, I learned from mutual acquaintances that Brandon had been fired. His family had become outcasts in their small town, where rumors spread faster than the wind. He sent out resumes, but no one responded. I wasn't happy, and I didn't regret it. I simply felt a sense of peace finally growing inside, as if justice didn't scream, didn't exact revenge, but simply put everything in its place, calmly, definitively, without regret. That spring, when everything around me smelled of new life, Daniel and I got married. It was a simple but incredibly beautiful ceremony, without unnecessary pomp, but with a warmth and sincerity that couldn't be faked. Daniel's parents welcomed me as if they'd been waiting for me their whole lives. My mother cried, unabashedly, and my father, usually reserved, smiled constantly adjusting his tie, as if wanting to make sure he looked worthy of this day. I remember standing opposite Daniel under an arch of white roses and thinking that for the first time in my life I felt safe, not loved out of pity, not accepted for convenience, but truly seen, as I am. After the wedding, we moved into the house my parents had once given me, the very house that became the arena for the Harris family's final act of madness. Back then, it seemed saturated with their presence, as if the walls held the echo of humiliation and fear, but now everything was different. This was the beginning of something new, something bright, in which there was no longer room for the past. Daniel and I repainted the master bedroom together, me in an old t-shirt, him with a paint stain on his cheek, laughing as the sun set. I remember him standing by the wall and saying, "Nothing here is foreign anymore, this house is yours, ours," and I nodded, feeling the traces of the past fade with each brushstroke. We threw out the old blanket where Mrs. Harris had once left muddy shoe prints and replaced the nightstand burned by Mr. Harris's cigarette. Everything their hands had touched, we replaced, as if cleansing the space of poison. The first year of our marriage was exactly how I always imagined a real relationship. We were partners, not in words, but in actions. We made decisions together, consulted even on the smallest details, and never once did either of us try to prove we knew better. When I stayed late at work, he'd already be cooking dinner, always something new, because, as he said, life is too short for repetition. When he was swamped with projects, I'd take care of the house, not feeling like a chore, just caring. Mutual and calm. His parents visited us several times, and each visit was warm and welcoming, without hidden judgment or attempts to interfere. They treated me not as a daughter-in-law, but as a daughter they could trust. My mother would call Daniel just to chat, about the weather, recipes, movies, and it was so touching that I'd sometimes listen to their conversations and smile without interfering. My father often invited him to play golf, and they'd return laughing like old friends. Work, too, was improving. After my presentation at the conference where it all began, I received several offers from large companies, but I stayed in the family business, not out of fear or habit, but out of pride. I wanted to grow the business my parents had built. I was promoted to vice president, and I dove headfirst into new projects, expanding to the West Coast, collaborating with major partners, and developing the brand. Daniel was always interested in my ideas, discussing the market and strategy with me. And I loved those evenings when we would share ideas, debate, laugh, and inspire each other over dinner. His company was also growing rapidly, and we celebrated each other's successes as if they were our own. One day, about a year after our wedding, I met a woman at a business meeting. She turned out to be an acquaintance from the past, someone who knew Brandon. We got to talking, and she said cautiously, "I heard he's back in West Virginia. He lives with his parents. He can't find a job." I froze for a second, as if trying to figure out what I was feeling, but inside, I felt empty. "Thank you," I said simply, "I wish him peace." And it was the truth. I felt neither anger nor satisfaction. He had destroyed what he had. He stalked me, threatened me, tried to humiliate me publicly. Everything that happened afterward was simply a consequence of his own actions. The woman also mentioned that Brandon's brother, Jacob, was divorced. Ashley, she said, had left because she was tired of the Harisa's endless drama. I wasn't surprised. Some families seem to carry their own curse, and everyone who comes near them begins to suffocate. Sometimes I thought back to that day, the day it all ended. Mrs. Harris sprawled on my bed in dirty shoes, Mr. Harris burning cigarette burns into the furniture, as if he wanted to leave his mark even on things. Brandon squeezing my wrist the first time I dared to say no. And there was no pain in those memories, only gratitude. Gratitude that my father stood up for me then, that I had the courage to walk away, call off the wedding, close the door, and never look back. Gratitude that the life I was so afraid of losing turned out to be better than I could have dreamed. Because if I had married Brandon, I knew I would have withered beside him. I would have lived in a house full of strange voices, where every step was accompanied by reproaches and demands. I would have paid for everyone, and never heard a thank you. I would have been a shadow of myself. But I chose the light, and now, every time I pass by the mirror, I see a woman who is no longer afraid to love, and to be loved correctly. If I hadn't stopped then, if I had allowed myself to believe that love can change a person, I would have married a man who believed that a woman needs to be beaten to become obedient. I often caught myself thinking how close I had come to that edge, to a life where pain becomes habit and fear hides behind a smile. But instead, I chose a completely different person, a man who didn't try to prove his superiority, who didn't break me, but carefully helped me put myself back together, a man who respected my opinions, my work, my independence, and even my weaknesses without turning them into weapons. I chose Daniel, and looking back, I realize it was the best decision of my life. 2 years had passed since our wedding, when one Saturday morning, over breakfast, amid the smell of freshly brewed coffee and the clink of cutlery, he said, without taking his eyes off the window, "I've been thinking about something." I looked up from my plate of omelette and smiled. "What is it this time? A new business idea?" He shook his head, slightly thoughtfully, as if weighing every word. "I want to start a foundation," he said, "for women, those starting out in business. I want to give them a chance, mentorship, scholarships, support, the opportunity to believe in themselves. What do you think?" I felt something stir inside me. "I think it's a wonderful idea," I replied, not hiding my excitement, "and I want to be a part of it." Thus began a new phase of our lives. We spent evenings planning, discussing potential programs, seeking partners, and reaching out to colleagues and friends who could help. I saw a real fire burning within him, not for profit, but because he genuinely wanted to change lives. 6 months later, the foundation was up and running. I joined the board of directors and took on mentoring. I met dozens of young women, just like us once were, brave, tired, confused, but unbroken. We met in the mornings over coffee, discussing their projects, dreams, and fears. I saw myself in them, the one who was once afraid to say no, the one who thought love and submission were the same thing, and by helping them, I seemed to heal the part of myself that had once lived in fear. One day, one of my clients, a petite girl with bright eyes and a notebook in her hand, asked, "Sharon, how did you know your husband was the one?" I thought about it. "Probably because he never tried to make me less than I am," I said quietly. "He wasn't afraid of my strength, didn't demand that I give up my work for him. He saw me as a partner, not a resource. He never questioned my freedom." She wrote something down in her notebook, and I added, "And his family, they accepted me from the very beginning, without conditions, without playing at superiority." That's also important. The man you marry is never alone, his entire family comes with him. 3 years after our wedding, we bought a vacation home in the mountains, an old stone house with a view of a spruce forest and a small stream behind the property. We'd go there on weekends, skiing in the winter, hiking the trails in the summer, and sitting by the fireplace in the evenings, listening to the wind whisper through the trees. There, I truly understood peace. Meanwhile, life went on. My parents were aging, and I took on more and more responsibility for the family business. Sometimes I had to work late, cancel plans, and come home tired and irritable, but Daniel never complained. He'd just come over, pour me tea, hug me, and say, "You don't have to be strong all the time, let yourself get tired." Sometimes, in rare moments of silence, I still thought of Brandon, less and less often, weaker and weaker. He became not a wound, but a scar, a reminder of what I'd been through. I didn't hate him, I didn't pity him, he was a lesson I needed to learn. I finally understood that love isn't proof, forgiveness, or sacrifice. Love without respect is a cage. I learned not to ignore warning signs and stopped believing that someone would change for me. I realized that respect isn't an addition to love, it's its foundation, and that the family you enter into can either support you or destroy you from within. The house that had once been the source of our conflicts was now a symbol of everything good that had happened in my life. Its walls no longer held pain, only laughter, warmth, and the smell of fresh bread in the morning. Here we hosted dinner parties, hosted friends, made plans, and dreamed of the future. Sometimes I would walk into the master bedroom and pause for a second, remembering that day, Mrs. Harris with her dirty shoes on my bed, the smell of smoke, the tension in the air, and every time I smiled, she hadn't won. This house belonged to me, my marriage belonged to me, my life belonged to me, and, perhaps for the first time in many years, I could say without a doubt, I am happy.